Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Natural Capital Matters webinar series. I'm very fortunate today to be joined by Kate Russell of Tellus Natural Capital, who will be taking us through the emerging policy around stacking and bundling. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much, Andrea, and thank you for inviting me to join you today. We're going to talk for about sort of half an hour or so and then have a bit of time for questions. So if questions occur to you during the presentation, please do put them in the chat box and we will come to them at the end. So stacking and bundling, very topical, and we were hoping that the DEFRA announcement would have come out when we first planned this webinar some weeks ago, and for once the timing worked well, so that many of you will be aware that there was an announcement last week, and we'll come on to the detail of that in a moment. What I'm going to take you through in the next half hour or so is a quick refresh on what I mean when I'm talking about ecosystem services, make sure we're all using the same sort of language, and explain a bit about how I interpret stacking and bundling and some of the different sort of different ways in which that is being proposed by different groups and organisations. We'll dwell briefly on additionality because it is still a really important element of all of this and something that still has the capacity to cause challenges. And then we'll work through a few very simple scenarios just to try and put a little bit of flesh on the bones. And we'll finish up by looking at some of the remaining challenges that are still out there. And that's probably where Andrea is going to want to come in and start talking about how Mills and Reeve might be able to support clients in terms of bringing some of these arrangements together and the more technical aspects of it. So ecosystem services then, this is probably very familiar to most of you, but I think it's worth just making sure that we're all on the same page when we start using this kind of language. The four sort of themes of ecosystem services, the supporting services underpin everything else. You've got your soil formation, your photosynthesis, and your nutrient cycle, and so on. The provisioning services tend to be the ones for which existing markets are already in place. So we have functioning financial markets for food and fuel and construction materials and so on. And then the regulating services are the ones where we're really starting to see interest in trying to create new opportunities for income streams to be attached to those services which have been provided almost as a byproduct of the provisioning services up until now. So we're talking about climate regulation, carbon capture, we're talking about water quality, natural flood management, and things like that. And then cultural services at the other end are the more human-focused ones, the tourism and the health and well-being. And there's a lot of interest around how we can monetize that. Of course, some people have been monetizing them for many years through tourism ventures and diversification, but we're looking increasingly at things like green social prescribing and access to the countryside for health and well-being. So that's the sort of framework that I'm using. And, you know, the question then is, can land deliver more than one of these at a time? And, you know, all of you probably sitting there on the webinar are shouting at the screen, yes, of course it can, Kate, don't be so ridiculous. And you look at a picture like this, which is a little snapshot in the Yorkshire Dales, and you can see at a glance that that countryside is delivering a huge range of ecosystem services. Quite apart from food, there will be recreation opportunities happening there. We can see the vegetation, which is not only sequestering carbon, but it's also acting as an air filter and cleaning particulates out of the air by the roadside. The trees and vegetation might also be producing fuel. They're interrupting rainfall and helping to slow the flow, and then maybe mitigating flood risk. But then we've also got the habitats for their own benefit and for the biodiversity they support, and all of the other bits of the jigsaw that come together. So those of us who are involved in managing rural land in any way it seems very obvious to us that land delivers multiple benefits all the time. It's quite difficult actually to think of a case where land only produces one single benefit without any of the others. So if that's the case, then the question is, why is stacking and bundling even an issue? Why has it become a bit of a talking point? And what are the barriers preventing it happening? So in order to dig into that a bit further, I think we need to understand what we mean when we're saying stacking and bundling. And it seems to be accepted, although there aren't really any hard and fast definitions, but it seems to be accepted that when we're talking about stacking, we're saying, can you have multiple ecosystem services on the same area of land, but being sold to different buyers with different contracts? So for example, we develop a habitat bank for BNG, Biodiversity Net Gain, and we sell the biodiversity credits to one buyer and the carbon credits from the wood that's growing on it to another buyer. Now, until now, that has been considered to be problematic because of the additionality rules, and we will go into detail on the additionality rules in a moment. But there is the risk that you're selling the same benefit more than once. And the problem with that is not just in, are you really selling anything worth having, but the perception from the buyer of what it is that they're acquiring, and has that really got the value that they are ascribing to it. Bundling, by contrast, tends to mean bringing together multiple ecosystem services, but then usually selling them to one buyer with one single contract. So, for example, you might be having a carbon credit scheme through woodland creation, for example, and there are other habitat benefits to planting that woodland, but the buyer is buying the carbon credit offset and taking the habitat benefits as a sort of bonus, if you like, paying a price that reflects that bonus, but not actually claiming the habitat as a formal offset. This is clearly a lot more simple if you're dealing with one buyer and one contract, one time scale, one set of terms and conditions. That has got to be much more simple than stacking, where you're looking to try and align different contracts, potentially over different time scales and with different terms and provisions within them. So just to bring it back to additionality then, and again, probably most of the audience today are familiar with this concept, but it's worth just sort of dwelling on it for a moment, because it's key where we're looking at offsetting credits. The finance that the offset credit unlocks must be fundamental to creating the benefit. So, for example, you want to buy a carbon credit, you're a business that wants to offset your carbon footprint. In order for you to be able to claim in any meaningful way that your business now has a lower carbon footprint, somebody else somewhere else has to be doing something additional that wasn't happening until you made the money available to create it. So this is about the activity being only additional because that funding is in place. And it's a really key concept where the credit being created is to be an offset credit in a recognized scheme where somebody is going to claim that their footprint is lower as a result of that. Same applies for biodiversity net gain. You know, the habitat that the developer has destroyed by creating the development, we need to create that plus the 10% under the new statutory scheme, and it must be an additional 10% that wasn't there before. So it can't be piggybacking on something else. And it's this additionality rule that has made it quite a challenge to think about how stacking can work in practice. So to take you through a couple of examples then, the Woodland Carbon Code has got two additionality tests in it. First of all, the legal additionality that you mustn't be required to plant the wood for any other reason. So you can't get a woodland carbon code scheme if your woodland creation is actually landscaping as part of a planning condition. And you can't get it if you're replanting a felled wood, for example. In fact, you can't get the woodland carbon code if the site was used for woodland in the past 25 years. So that's the first test. The second test is then the investment test, which is the financial one. Without the carbon finance, the tree planting wouldn't have been the most financially attractive option for the land, or it wouldn't have been economically viable. That has thrown some challenges up, as those of you who have been involved in forestry in the past sort of 5 or 10 years will recognise, because planting new forestry has become much more financially viable under its own steam without necessarily needing the carbon finance. So that has thrown some challenges up in some cases. In the peatland code, it's slightly more complicated, because peatland carbon code is about emissions reduction, not about carbon sequestration, and it's slightly more complex. So you've got to meet tests 1 and 2, which is the same legal obligation as under the woodland code. You mustn't have any other reason why you're obliged to restore the peat. And you must then test 2, financial feasibility. The carbon finance has got to be funding at least 15% of the project costs. So that's quite a challenge in the current carbon market, where the prices are not yet really terribly strong. And then you've also got to meet either test 3 or 4. So the investment test is the same as under the woodland code. And then test 4 is about other barriers to implementation. So that's thinking particularly about peatland restoration in the uplands, where you might have SSSI, SPA designations that need to be addressed, or there might be consequences about, this is on open access land and the re-wetting is going to cause problems with access. All of those other barriers need to have been met before you can meet the code requirements. So given that those 2 codes are the sort of strongest codes we have in the UK at the moment in relation to offset credits, what did they have to say about stacking and bundling? Well, interestingly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, they both use the same wording. And I think there's a recognition here that it may be possible to stack credits in the future, but acknowledging that there's going to need to be credible standards and methodologies to actually underpin that, and that those methodologies and standards are recognised and approved by whichever code you're using, and that any income coming out is declared so that it can be taken into account in the financial viability tests. And the final point, making claims clear and explicit, comes back to the need for transparency, which comes down to the credibility of this whole system. A buyer is only going to have confidence in buying if they're sure that they're not being sold snake oil, effectively. So about the credibility that is really important to underpin and challenge any potential claims for greenwashing. So how does this translate into biodiversity net gain? Well, this is where we saw the announcements just last week. DEFRA guidance came out in its response to last year's consultation on the implementation of biodiversity net gain. And the point that is of particular interest for today, there were some other bits and pieces in there as well, but the point of particular interest for today was DEFRA's statement that biodiversity net gain and nutrient neutrality credits can be stacked on the same land. So you'll be familiar with nutrient neutrality if you are in or affected by one of the protected catchments. And in those protected catchments where watercourses, are being polluted by nitrates and phosphates, there is a restriction on development unless that development is nutrient neutral. The result of that is that the developers are then looking where they can't make a development nutrient neutral on-site, are looking for off-site opportunities to change land use elsewhere, to reduce the nutrients being applied to farmland, for example, and then using the credits released by that to be able to enable them to carry out the development elsewhere in the same catchment. The kind of land use change we're seeing under nutrient neutrality, it might be as simple as moving from very intensive farming use, pigs and poultry would be top of the list, or intensive dairy, through to very extensive agricultural use, but that might require quite a substantial area of land to be able to generate enough nutrient saving. But we're also seeing long-term land use change under nutrient neutrality, woodland planting and the creation of constructed wetlands, both of those being preferred in some cases by the planning authorities because it's very easy to check from a verification point of view that the land is not going back into agricultural use. So you can see cases where you would create some wetland, there would be fringes around the wetland, some land that might be wet part of the year and not all of the year. and those fringe habitats that might generate some really good opportunities for habitat enhancement as well. And likewise, if it was woodland planting for nutrient neutrality, again, there will be habitat benefits to that woodland apart from what it's doing in soaking up nutrients. So DEFRA has said, we recognise that these sites can deliver both those benefits, and we are going to facilitate the sale of both lots of credits. And it's important that this is going to be possible because it will really help the financial viability of some of those nutrient neutrality sites in particular. They are very long-term sites, 80 to 125 years. The challenges in creating a constructed wetland, for example, are pretty high risk and require quite a lot of upfront expenditure. So the opportunity to be able to sell more than one product, and for developers as well to be able to meet their requirements for nutrient credits and biodiversity credits on the same site, you know, there's a neatness to the whole thing and there's a logic to that. So I think it's a really important step forward that DEFRA has given us this statement. We now have to work out some of the practicalities around how that's actually going to be delivered, but it's an important step forward. So alongside the consultation response, DEFRA then published another bit of guidance, the sort of first draft early stage guidance on this, in which it also said that it can see that it might be possible, it's a may at this stage, for either biodiversity or nutrient credits to be stacked on land being used for carbon credits, so probably most likely on woodland planting, or on land used for agri-environment schemes, provided that you can clearly see that additional habitat enhancement has been done over and above what was done for the carbon credit scheme or for the agri-environment scheme, and that additional habitat enhancement must be able to be defined. So we'll drill a little bit further into that in a moment. The guidance is there. I've put the link up, combining environmental payments, and I expect this guidance to be added to and develop further as time goes on. And you'll know that we're waiting for the more detailed regulations on BNG anyway, so all of these should tie in together. So the idea of combining offsets isn't entirely novel. Wilder Carbon was one of the projects that's been funded under the NERF round of funding, and it's a project that Kent Wildlife Trust is leading to develop a sort of carbon plus biodiversity credit package. Of that package with carbon and habitat, only the carbon element is going to be a recognised offset, but it is trying to establish a market for carbon plus. So will buyers in a voluntary marketplace be prepared to pay a little bit more for a carbon offset that is delivering recognised, acknowledged and defined habitat enhancement as well? That's an interesting question, and it's not really a very straightforward question because, of course, carbon credits themselves are a voluntary market in the UK at the moment. It's a discretionary spend. So will we find businesses that are actually going to step up and say, yes, I'll pay over and above what I could pay for a bog standard carbon credit in order to have one that's delivering these defined and acknowledged habitat benefits? And only time will tell on that one. But we also mustn't forget the non-offset markets. I've focused on offsets because they come with all the baggage around additionality and the rules and regulations. But of course, there are other voluntary markets out there where businesses are interested in being able to reduce their environmental footprint more generally, to reassure stakeholders and investors that their business is moving in the right direction, to reduce its impact on the environment, but it isn't necessarily requiring a formal offset agreement. And if that's the case, then additionality falls away. It isn't necessarily an issue. But buyers are still going to want to have confidence in this thing that they are buying and that they are not being sold the same thing over and over again, that it's not some sort of dreadful pyramid scheme, or that they are actually being able to create benefit from the money that they're investing. So transparency, as I've said before, is going to be really important. Verification, reporting. What is the buyer going to need in order to be able to satisfy themselves that this is a good deal for them? But there are going to be, we expect, some really interesting opportunities in that market area. So we're going to just have a look at a couple of simple, very simplified examples now to see how this might sort of emerge in practice. So here we are, we've got a very detailed design here for a sheep farm. And there is a watercourse running through it that's been heavily modified in the past. And what are our options for dealing with this? We have a landowner who'd like to do some habitat creation work. So we've got our modified watercourse and not much else, some heavily grazed grass. There is interest in doing some woodland planting. So we've designated a part of the land and said that would be suitable for a little bit of mixed woodland planting. We've seen the potential for some riparian enhancement around that watercourse. We might do a bit of remeandering and some riparian planting. And then there's an opportunity to create species-rich grassland on the other side of the watercourse. So we've got three potential elements. And in order to try and manage expectations and manage the additionality challenge, what we're going to do in the first instance is look at lotting. So buyer one might be interested in carbon credits. We've got a tree planting scheme, provided we register it before we start planting and we go through the various requirements to register that land on the UK carbon registry, we may be able to offer carbon credits from our woodland planting. And we've drawn a red line around it and said, this is the geographic location of that, and it is exclusive within that for carbon credits. The second product that we're developing here is a nutrient neutrality credit, and that's around our watercourse work. So our riparian planting and our watercourse work have enabled us to reduce runoff, save on pollutants, and we can then look at packaging that up and selling it as nutrient credits, again, within our red line boundary. And our third product here is biodiversity offsets. So our species-rich grassland that we're creating, again, we've been through all of the processes to have that assessed under the biodiversity metric, a management plan in place, and it's going to be secured with a Section 106 agreement or a conservation covenant for the duration of the term. So we've got three products, three separate buyers, three lotted geographic locations. And that was how we were starting to think about schemes before DEFRA's announcement about stacking. If we now are in a position where we can stack BNG and nitrates, that might change the position for our package here. We might still want to lot off our woodland separately and sell the carbon off that. But where we were looking to sell just nutrient neutrality credits, we might now be able to also assess that site for BNG, to run a biodiversity metric through it, and to be able to sell that developer two products off one piece of land. Likewise, our third buyer might only want the biodiversity credits, but it may well be that actually with the work we're doing on that land, reducing the intensity of agriculture on it, potentially we could have looked to create some nitrate credits off that as well. So we're sort of moving slightly to the next step of looking to be able to stack more than one thing at a time. Bundling, by contrast, we might then say, well, we've done these various measures across our land as a whole, but we've not been so worried about lotting it up into red line areas. We're doing habitat enhancement across the range of this land. So we've then gone and found ourselves a corporate buyer who's interested in their own net zero journey, their own task force for nature-related financial disclosure commitments, and they want some carbon credits. So we're going to sell them some carbon credits and we can verify those and they're through the formal recognised system, but we're selling them with other benefits that come with it, with biodiversity benefits. There's some natural flood management benefits in here and recreation opportunities for the local community. And all of that might serve our buyer well in terms of their community engagement, their stakeholder responsibilities, but only the carbon credits out of that are being used as a formal offset. Then another potential alternative is to stack benefits in some areas and share them in others. So, for example, on the same area of land, we might have a buyer that says, look, I'm really interested in your natural flood management work here. I'm prepared to put money into your big project, but I want my money to be targeting the natural flood management work. We might have another buyer who says, I'm very interested in supporting green social prescribing. Our NHS local trust is putting some money into that to enable access and active recreation over this land, and that's what we'll target. We might find a third buyer who wants some formal offsets for biodiversity. And if we've done our biodiversity metric assessments and we've got our formal agreements in place, perhaps we can package something together for them as well. So in our big overall scheme for this land, we might have different buyers putting in money for different things. And then potentially they might all want to take a share of the carbon sequestration right across the whole piece. And we could sell carbon credits to each of them, 3 of them from our carbon scheme within that. So it could be that there could be quite complex schemes, but I imagine that Andrea would look at that and go, "Ooh, crikey, that's going to be a challenge. We've got 3 different buyers buying perhaps 4 different things. There's going to be contracts need to be aligned. They mustn't overlap each other. How are the timescales going to work? What's going to happen in the event of risk management? What happens if part of this fails? You know, there are lots of things that we would actually then need to start tackling. But in theory, something like this could be the way that we see things develop in the future. So then just bringing it back to look at the agri-environment scheme angle, it's a number of people have been talking for a while about whether we can use existing agri-environment schemes as a sort of foundation layer and then stack private schemes on top of it. And of course, DEFRA's work on landscape recovery is trying to look at building models that could do exactly that. So we start out with our sheep farm, and we've got a bit of watercourse. Level 1, we're going to go into Sustainable Farm Incentive and Countryside Stewardship Plus. That is going to fund the creation of some species-rich grassland, which we're going to manage with native breed cattle, and it's going to fund some livestock fencing to keep the stock away from the watercourse. So we have our foundation in place now from SFI and stewardship, government funded. But if we then want to do something additional and further that creates different opportunities, we might be able to layer it over the top. So we've got a potential opportunity, let's say, for natural flood management funding. We could do some riparian planting, we could do some infield bunds to slow the runoff, and maybe that could be funded by water company, it could be funded by the local authority, perhaps the Environment Agency has got a pot of funding we could reach into. But it's clearly additional to the work that's been funded by the stewardship scheme underneath. Now, the challenge in all of that is going to be about timescales, because if our stewardship scheme is only 5 years or 10 years, is that long enough for our natural flood management funders to be interested, or are they going to want a longer timescale? And if they do want a longer timescale, what happens if stewardship funding isn't going to be available? Is that foundation that we've built going to bring the whole pack of cards down if it's withdrawn? So lots of things to keep thinking about. But this idea of cross-subsidising is an interesting one. Could we use the BNG credits to help fund natural flood management, for example, where the financial value of the natural flood management is much harder to pin down? Could the carbon credits fund peri-urban woodlands that are going to be delivering benefits to the local communities in terms of air quality and recreation? And how do we capture the value in all of that? That's the really hard part. So just a few moments then to sort of bring things together on challenges and risks, and this might generate some questions in the chat later on. Governance is going to be an important part of this. Who is going to be responsible for delivery, particularly when we've got multiple products being offered? And how are the funds that come in going to be then managed and distributed? In a lot of cases, when we're talking about credits for developers, nutrient credits or biodiversity credits, they're going to want to pay a lump sum and walk away. They certainly don't want to be engaged in something ongoing for 30 years. So how is that lump sum going to be held, managed safely, and distributed out in annual payments to the land managers in order to fund the ongoing management of the land? What we're starting to see is farmer clusters are using things like CICs, community interest companies, and cooperative organisations to be able to deliver that. They come with a cost, they come with needing establishment and regulation and ongoing oversight. And what about the independent oversight of all of this? We still don't know who are going to be the responsible bodies for BNG. We're still waiting for that information from government about how that system is going to work. But independent verification and monitoring is going to be important. What will the buyers want in terms of governance in order for them to feel confident in the product they're being offered? Verification and auditing is not going to be cheap. How often are you going to need your site verified or audited? Who's going to do the work? What charges are they going to make to you? How is that data going to be captured and preserved, and who's going to own the data? That's going to be quite important going forward. But thinking about that over the lifetime of a project, particularly if you're looking at nutrient projects of sort of 100-year lifetimes, how on earth are we going to plan for the cost of that verification or auditing over that period of time? And timescales themselves, I think there's going to be challenges about trying to mix and match. So, for example, government is saying, well, yes, if you stack BNG and nutrients on the same land, you've got a timescale difference. And DEFRA's initial response to this is, well, you might come to the end of your BNG work, 30-year plan. Perhaps then you look at how can we further enhance the habitats that we have on our site and offer new and additional credits for another 30 years. Of course, by then it might not be a 30-year requirement. Statute might have changed. It might be a 50 or 100-year requirement. Who knows? But there is the potential to have funding gaps in between if you are trying to manage more than one. And that's something that we're going to need to try and get our heads around. Contract terms will really be a matter for Andrea to dwell on, but, conservation covenants, everybody's hanging on the edge waiting for them to happen, but we haven't got all of the detail in place yet. Will we see standard terms being put forward in future, or is every single agreement going to have to be bespoke? And if so, what's that going to cost? How often are these things going to be reviewed? Will there be a payment review mechanism built in? And if so, how? And what's going to happen when things go wrong, as I'm sure in some cases they will? Maintenance in the long term, farmers are quite good at budgeting for the relatively short term, but how much is it going to cost you to manage a traditionally managed hay meadow in 27 years' time? What's going to be the price of the labour? What's going to be the price of the machinery? Is your tractor even going to run on diesel in 27 years' time? And if not, what's the fuel going to cost? How are we going to work out those very long-term budgets? It's going to be a challenge, because what we don't want is the landowner to run out of money before the end of the scheme. So there we go. That's taken us up until just short of 25 to. I think we've now, all being well, Andrea, got 10, 15 minutes or so for questions, if there are any in the chat. But the key message, of course, coming from a consultant is there's lots of uncertainty. You will need to take advice.
Thanks very much, Kate. We have started to receive some questions in the chat. The first point that occurs to me as a landowner advisor is that when clients are wanting to understand what their obligations may be in any arrangement, the first point is probably to understand in which arrangements there may be a code already in place that can be complied with, and where the code has yet to evolve, that it might be useful for people to hear how difficult is it to establish which code applies, where the details of the code are. Is this information really easy for people to find?
It's relatively easy at the moment if we're talking about codes for formal offsets, because there are really only three. There's the Woodland Carbon Code for woodland carbon credits, the Peatland Code for peatland carbon credits, and then it's not really a code, but the biodiversity metric for biodiversity offsetting. And the biodiversity metric really is the measurement tool for how much biodiversity is created. And then the concept of the credit will be built in around the agreement, which is either a Section 106 agreement at the moment or, in due course, a conservation covenant. But the metric is how you verify the number of biodiversity credits that you're going to create off the site. So at the moment, there are really only those three formally recognised codes in the UK, and the biodiversity metric is actually only England. When it comes to soil, there is a work group that has been looking at whether it is possible to devise a farmland soil carbon code. And my understanding of the current position is that they've slightly moved back from that, because they've recognised that it is technically an awful lot more difficult than to do a carbon code for woodland or peat, because there's so many variables in soil. And the big issue, of course, with soil is permanence, because you can do a lot of good things with restoring soil organic matter, using your cover crops, using your herbal lays, piling organic matter into the soil, minimum tillage and everything else. But that is, it's very hard to lock that down, and future activity could release the carbon dioxide out of it again. So the permanence issue has been quite a challenge, I think. So my understanding of where the work on the soil carbon code has got to is that it's slightly stepped back to say, we recognise the market is now developing lots of schemes. So the Soil Capital programme is the one that Chris has flagged up, but there's the Greener one, there's Trinity AgTech, there are dozens of others, some being developed by supply chains. And what I think the Sustainable Soils Alliance is looking at now is trying to establish a set of principles by which those schemes can be assessed and judged. So they will be looking at what is behind the verification of the scheme, what circumstances, what steps have to be taken, how robust is it, what is the measuring and verification like, how secure is it, so that a buyer who wants to be able to say, I'm investing in soil carbon, can have some way of looking and comparing the different schemes in the marketplace and deciding which of those on offer most meets their requirements. But at the moment, those are not formal carbon offsets for all the challenges that come with it. The other one that's probably worth just picking up while we're talking about codes is the hedgerow carbon code, which GWCT are working on at the moment. Again, they got some project funding from DEFRA to develop a hedgerow carbon code. They're running the trials for that at the Allerton project. And they do say that they are hoping and expecting to be able to launch a hedgerow carbon code. I don't know when, I'm not privy to inside information on that one, but that clearly will be a really exciting opportunity. You can see all kinds of scope for rolling out new hedgerows and investment in restoration of hedgerows all over the place, that I think could be really attractive to farmers because it gives them the opportunity to enhance the landscape whilst carrying on with productive agriculture in the middle of the fields, but also quite appealing to buyers. It's a very iconic part of the English landscape, a hedge, and I think buyers will find it quite easy to relate to. So we'll look forward to seeing details of that when it emerges.
That's very helpful. I think it brings me on to a very broad question we've had raised in the chat, which is around leaders in the field. The question is, bodies like the Natural Trust and the RSPB, are we seeing them lead the way, or is this very much the enthusiastic farmer that will take those first steps in habitat creation, and perhaps the larger organisations are waiting to see what happens? What's your experience, Kate?
Yeah, very, very interesting question. I think it's some and some, to be quite honest. I think DEFRA, through the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, NERF, funded about 50 projects in 2 rounds to be pilots, to test models, to really try and work some of the practicalities of these through. And the organisations who are delivering those NERF projects, there's quite a broad range of organisations, but they've tended quite often to be led by conservation charities. So a number of the wildlife trusts are quite involved. I mentioned the Wilder Carbon Project, which is led by Kent Wildlife Trust. There are some private estates running NERF projects and trying to work up the models themselves, and private estates outside of that NERF funding doing things with other income streams and other support, funded by the likes of Esme Fairbairn Foundation and Triodos Bank, who are interested in this sort of patient capital approach and trying to sort of get started. So we are seeing quite a good range, and I think that's really important. We need lots of different types of models to be developed at this stage. We need to throw lots of ideas out there to find out which are going to be the ones that will turn into significant and useful and replicable opportunities to roll out more widely. I think the private sector is very keen to get involved in some cases, and forging ahead with deals where good partnership opportunities arise. So where a private landowner already has a relationship with somebody who might want to invest, there are opportunities that they're just seizing on and working up and doing commercial contracts. I think it can be more of a challenge for big organizations like the National Trust. They've got multiple objectives, multiple stakeholders, and seriously large commitments already. So it won't necessarily be as easy for them to be as light on their feet. But, I've had some very interesting conversations with them about potential things that they have got in the pipeline. And RSPB has already been heavily involved in things like compensatory habitat schemes on the back of big infrastructure projects. So they have experience in delivery and making wetlands and things work on the ground for bird populations. But again, in terms of sort of overall, I wouldn't necessarily say they were sort of at the front of the field in this, but it is a very mixed picture.
Thank you for those comments. I mean, it's such a complex piece. If individuals are looking for case studies, whether it be how to join together to bring an offering to market, or in particular, if they are in, say, an upland environment and want to know what would really work in their location, how would they go about finding that information? Again, is it people grouping together through the NFU? What is your experience?
Yeah, there are case studies emerging all over the place, but it's not that easy to find them at the moment, to be fair. We are expecting more feedback from the first round NERF projects. Part of the conditions of getting a NERF grant was that you had to feedback and be prepared to engage in knowledge exchange and discuss your projects so that others can learn from it. But the first round of those was only last year. So we will expect to see more information coming out from those over the next 12, 18, 24 months, the first round and then the second round projects. Organisations like the Environment Agency have a huge amount of information and case studies around their natural flood management projects. So, but again, it's not very easily sort of publicly accessible at this stage. I think it's just that we're quite early on, and a lot of these pilots and models are still ongoing. So keep your eyes open, keep looking. There will be stuff out there. The internet is a fantastic place, but you have to be quite targeted in what you're searching for. Where I think the question's been raised about upland livestock farms, they can present challenges. It very much depends on what you've got to start with. And one of the big difficulties around the way that we're working at the moment is that the rewards tend to be there for those who have an opportunity to improve biodiversity, to improve on poor nutrient management. It's slightly rewarding the people that haven't necessarily been managing the land in that way to start with. And where we have a particular challenge in the uplands, I think, often quite heavily designated landscapes, often quite biodiverse already. Where is the headroom for the improvement? A lot of the models and the income streams at the moment rely on you changing land use and doing something different. So where is the opportunity to change the land use to a great enough degree that you will create the carbon credit, the biodiversity credit, the nutrient credit that has a value attached to it? And at the moment, that's not always easy to do in an upland livestock situation, which is why we still need government funding. We still need stewardship. We still need stewardship plus. But then we're looking at landscape recovery as well. We're looking at collaboration. And I think farmers getting together and looking at what they could change in a catchment or in a landscape scale could offer that opportunity to really step up.
Thank you. And just ending, conscious of time, just ending on a question of a slightly different theme here, which is where a corporate has TNFD requirements, is it that they would want to purchase biodiversity offsets rather than just carbon plus?
Yes, I think we're still waiting to understand how corporates are going to deliver on TNFD commitments, but they also have climate commitments to deliver on in many cases. So the fact that those two are still in separate categories isn't necessarily terribly helpful, really. I think we're going to see them come closer together, and a recognition that you can't solve climate change without also tackling environmental enhancement and work to restore the environment. And likewise, work that you do to restore the environment would, we should hope, have a positive impact on the climate. So I think actually we need to start getting those two much more closely aligned. And one of the things that I think will be interesting to watch as we go forward is how we will then be able to package environmental credits rather than them having to be a carbon credit or having to be a biodiversity credit. Will we actually see a future generation where it's this, if you do this work with this project, it's signed off, it's certified, it's all approved, that will help you meet multiple outcomes, multiple benefits.
Indeed, and that really brings us round to today's topic, isn't it? It's about seizing those opportunities where bundling is the ideal, but the reality is that we're going to see stacking ever more as the opportunities progress. So I'd like to thank you, Kate, for your contribution today, which has been really informative. And thank you also to everybody for coming along to our webinar. And a quick plug for the other webinars in our series. We're going to be looking at managing productive and habitat managed farms side by side in roughly 3 weeks' time. And our third and final seminar in the series will focus on nutrient neutrality. So thank you very much for everybody who's come along today.